Good evening. Welcome to the stream. Okay. How's everybody doing? So, so we left off on a very, sorry, I'm making weird throat noises, on a very weird place as of last episode. I didn't get to finish the story that I was reading because it is a long story, and I'm gonna have to do a little bit of a recap here. So, this current book that we're reading is called the Randolph Carter Tales, and it's a assortment of stories that follow the self-insert of H.P. Lovecraft into his own stories, named Randolph Carter, and the story takes place within a dreamscape of sorts. This man is dreaming and having an adventure while he is dreaming. He is trying to get to the top of a mountain where he will find the fabled outer gods, and at which point we do not know why he wants to do this, but he is doing it nonetheless. He has come across creatures of the sort of like Zoogs, the mischievous Zoogs. Zoogs, yes, I'm saying that correctly. He went to a town and made friends with a cat. And then he got captured and was made a slave. And he was taken to a port across the sea. And his slave drivers were selling him to these creatures that didn't have faces, but they had like tendrils on their noses, and they were gelatinous and pretty weird creatures, and it looked pretty bleak for our main character until a whole horde of cats just came out of nowhere and just absolutely decimated these jelly creatures. And they only did this because he made friends with a cat in the previous town. So he said, "This guy checks out. Let's go save this guy from the gelatinous people." And after that, he got captured by some ghouls and was thrown into a pit where he was subsequently saved by some ghouls. And the only way back to where he needed to go was underground through the Gug city, the city where all the Gugs are, and these creatures are not to be taken lightly. They are massive 20-foot tall hairy creatures with vertical mouths instead of horizontal, and filled with sharp teeth and such. And the gugs and the ghasts, not to be confused with ghouls, were at each other's throats, and ghasts would descend into gug territory to try to find gugs to eat, and gugs would find these ghasts to be a nuisance and kill them if they saw them. But these ghasts were afraid of ghouls, and so it was a little complicated for Randolph and the ghouls to be going through the city to get back to where he needed to go. So ghouls, ghasts, gugs. Ghouls, milk steak. Ghouls and milk steak. And that's where we left off. No, we do not want to protect the gugs. The gugs are not good. The gugs were cursed and put into the earth. They had committed a crime, and they are atoning for it by being thrown underground, and they cannot get out. Gugs are not good. Gugs and ghasts, those are the bad guys. You don't want to be walking down a dark alley at night and run into a gug or a ghast. Ghouls are okay though. Ghouls are okay. So, I again have another Amaretto Sour, very, very good. I have made, I made it with a little bit of blackberry lemonade this time, so we'll see how that goes. But Amaretto Sour recipe is in the description if you're interested in making it at home. Goes. Alright. So, without further ado, I will attempt to finish this tonight. Not the entire book, but just the story. Got, if you can see this center strip of pages, that's how long we have to go to finish this single story. It may not look like a lot, but it is 70 pages, so it's quite a bit. We'll see what we can do. Alright. It was now night in that redoubtable wood of monstrous trees, but because of the phosphorescence, one might travel as well as by day. Wherefore, Carter set out upon the well-known route toward Cepheus and Uth-Nargai beyond the Chenarian hills. And as he went, he thought of the zebra he had left tethered to an ash tree on Agronic, in faraway Oriab so many eons ago, and wondered if any lava gatherer had fed and released it. And he wondered, too, if he would ever return to Baharna and pay for the zebra that was slain by night in those ancient ruins by Yoth's shore. And if the old tavern keeper would remember him. Such were the thoughts that came to him in the air of the regained upper dreamland. But presently his progress was halted by a sound from a very large hollow tree. He had avoided the great circle of stones, since he did not care to speak with the Zoogs just now, but it appeared from a singular fluttering in the huge tree that important councils were in session elsewhere. Upon drawing nearer, he made out the accents of a tense and heated discussion, and before long became conscious of matters which he viewed with the greatest concern. For a war on the cats was under debate in the sovereign assembly of the Zoogs. It all came from the loss of the party which had sneaked after Carter to Ulthar, and which the cats had justly punished for unsuitable intentions. The matter had long rankled, and now, or within at least a month, the marshaled Zoogs were about to strike the whole feline tribe in a series of surprise attacks, taking individual cats or groups of cats unawares, and giving not even the myriad of cats of Ulthar a proper chance to drill and mobilize. This was the plan of the Zoogs, and Carter saw that he must foil it before leaving on his mighty quest. I think we're done saying Gug. I think there's no more Gugs in the story, so let's go with cats for now. Very quietly, therefore, did Randolph steal to the edge of the wood and send a cry of the cat over the starlit fields. And a great grimalkin in a nearby cottage took up the burden and relayed it across leagues of rolling meadow to warriors large and small, black, gray, tiger, white, yellow, and mixed, and it echoed through near and beyond the sky even into Ulthar, and Ulthar's numerous cats called in chorus and fell into line of march. It was fortunate that the moon was not up, so that all the cats were on earth. Swiftly and silently leaping, they sprang from every hearth and housetop and poured in a great furry sea across the plains to the edge of the wood. Carter was there to greet them, and the sight of the shapely, wholesome cats was indeed good for his eyes, after the things he had seen and walked with in the abyss. He was glad to see his venerable friend and one-time rescuer at the head of Ulthar's detachment, a collar of rank around his sleek neck and whiskers bristling at a martial angle. Better still, as a sub-lieutenant in the army, was a brisk young fellow who proved to be none other than a very little cat at the inn, to whom Carter had given a saucer of rich cream on that long-vanished morning in Ulthar. He was a strapping and promising cat now, and purred as shook hands with his friends. His grandfather said he was doing very well in the army, and that he might well expect a captaincy after one more campaign. Carter now outlined the peril of the cat tribe, and was rewarded by deep-throated purrs of gratitude from all sides. Consulting with the generals, he prepared a plan of instant action, which involved marching at once upon the Zoog Council and other known strongholds of the Zoogs, forestalling their surprise attacks and forcing them to terms before the mobilization of their army of invasion. Thereupon, without a moment's loss, that great ocean of cats flooded the enchanted wood and surged around the council tree and the great stone circle. Flutterings rose to panic pitch as the enemy saw the newcomers, and there was very little resistance among the furtive and curious brown Zoogs. They saw that they were beaten in advance and turned from thoughts of vengeance to the thoughts of present self-preservation. Half the cats now seated themselves in a circular formation with the captured Zoogs in the center, leaving upon a lane down which were marched the additional captives, rounded up by the other cats in other parts of the wood. Terms were discussed at length, Carter acting as an interpreter, and it was decided that the Zoogs might remain a free tribe on condition of rendering to the cats a large annual tribute of grouse, quail, pheasants, and the less fabulous parts of the forest. 12 young Zoogs of noble families were taken as hostages to be kept in the Temple of the Cats at Ulthar, and the victors made it plain that any disappearances of the cats on the borders of the Zoog domain would be followed by consequences highly disastrous to the Zoogs. These matters disposed of, the assembled cats broke ranks and permitted the Zoogs to slink off one by one to their respective homes, which they hastened to do with many a sullen backward glance. The old cat general now offered Carter an escort through the forest to whatever border he had wished to reach, deeming it likely that the Zoogs would harbor dire resentment against him for the frustration of their warlike enterprise. This offer he welcomed with gratitude, not only for the safety it afforded, but because he liked the graceful companionship of cats. So in the midst of a pleasant and playful regiment, relaxed after the successful performance of his duty, Randolph Carter walked with dignity through the enchanted and phosphorescent wood of Titan trees, talking of his quest with the old general and his grandson, whilst others of the band indulged in fantastic gambols or chased fallen leaves that the wind drove among the fungi of the primeval floor. And the old cat said that he had heard much of the unknown Kadath in the cold waste, but did not know where it was. As for the marvelous Sunset City, he had not even heard of that, but would gladly relate to Carter anything that he might later learn. He gave the seeker some passwords of great value among the cats of Dreamland, and commended him especially to the old chief of the cats in Cepheus, whither he was bound. That old cat, already slightly known to Carter, was a dignified Maltese, and would prove highly influential in any transaction. It was dawn before they came to the proper edge of the wood, and Carter bade his friends a reluctant farewell. The young sub-lieutenant he had met as a small cat would have followed him had not the old general forbidden it, but the austere patriarch insisted that the path of duty lay with the tribe and the army. So Carter set out alone on the path over the golden fields that stretched mysterious beside the willow-fringed river, and the cats went back into the wood. Well did the traveler know those garden lands that heap betwixt the wood and the Cernaean sea, and blithely did he follow the singing river Orcanos that marked his course. The sun rose higher over gentle slopes of grove and lawn, and heightened the colors of 1,000 flowers that starred each knoll and dingle. A blessed haze lies upon this region, wherein is held a little more of the sunlight than other places hold, a little more of the summer's humming music of the birds and bees, so that men walk through it as though a fairy place, and feel greater joy and wonder than they could ever afterward remember. By noon, Carter reached the jasper terraces of Curan, which slope down through the river's edge and bear that a temple, loveliness wherein the king of Iwekvad comes from his far realm on the twilight sea once a year in the golden palanquin to pray to the god of Okranos, who sang to him in his youth, where he dwelt in a cottage by its banks. All of Jasper is that temple, and covering an acre of ground with its walls and courts, its 7 pinnacled towers, and its inner shrine, where the river enters through hidden channels, and God sings softly in the night. Many times the moon hears a strange music as it shines on the courts and terraces and pinnacles, but whether that music be the song of a god or the chant of cryptical priests, none but the king of Iwekvad may say. For only he has entered the temple or seen the priests. Now, in the drowsiness of day, that carven and delicate fane was silent, and Carter heard only the murmur of the great stream and the hum of the birds and the bees as he walked onward towards the enchanted sun. All that afternoon, the pilgrim wandered on through the perfumed meadows and the ice of gentle riverward hills, bearing peaceful thatched cottages and the shrines of amiable gods carven from the jasper or chrysoberyl. Sometimes he walked close to the bank of Orkanos and whistled to the sprightly and iridescent fish of that crystal stream, and at other times he paused amidst the whispering rushes and gazed at the great dark wood of the farther side, whose trees came down clear to the water's edge. In former dreams he had seen quaint lumbering bullpoths come shyly out of that wood to drink, but now he could not glimpse any. Once in a while he paused to watch the carnivorous fish catch a fishing bird, which it lured to the water by shooing its tempting scales to the sun, and grasped by its beak with its enormous mouth as the winged hunter sought to dart down upon it. Toward evening he mounted a low grassy rise and saw before him, flaming in the sunset, the 1,000 gilded spires of Thrawn. Lofty beyond belief are the alabaster walls of that incredible city, sloping inward toward the top and wrought in one solid piece by what means no man knows, for they are more ancient than memory. Yet lofty as they are, with 100 gates and 200 turrets, the clustered towers within, all white beneath their golden spires, are loftier still, so that men on the plain around them see them soaring into the sky, sometimes shining clear, sometimes caught at the top in tangles of cloud and mist, and sometimes clouded lower down with their utmost pinnacles blazing free above the vapors. And where Thrawn's gates open on the river are great wharves of marble with ornate galleons of fragrant cedar and calamander riding gently at anchor, and strange bearded sailors sitting on casks and bales with their hieroglyphs of far places. Landward beyond the walls lies the farm country, where small white cottages dream between little hills, and narrow roads with many stone bridges wind gracefully among streams and gardens. Down through the verdant land Carter walked at evening, and saw twilight float up from the river to the marvelous golden spires of Thrawn. And just at the hour of dusk he came to the southern gate, and was stopped by a red-robed sentry, till he had told 3 dreams beyond belief, and proved himself a dreamer worthy to walk up Thrawn's steep, mysterious streets, and linger in bazaars where the wares of ornate galleons were sold. Then into that incredible city he walked, through a wall so thick that the gate was a tunnel, and therefore, amidst the curved and undulant ways winding deep and narrow between the heavenward towers. Lights shone through grated and balconied windows, and the sound of lutes and pipes stole timid from inner courts where marble fountains bubbled. Carter knew his way, and edged down through darker streets to the river, where an old sea tavern he found the captains and sea folk he had known to myriad other dreams. There he bought passage into Cepheus on a great green galleon, and there he stopped for the night after speaking gravely to the venerable cat of the inn, who blinked dozing before an enormous hearth and dreamed of old wars and forgotten gods. In the morning, Carter boarded the galleon bound for Cepheus, and sat upon the prow as the ropes were cast off and the long sail down the Cenarian Sea began. For many leagues the banks were much as they were above Thrawn, and with now and then a curious temple rising on the farther hills towards the right, and a drowsy village on the shore, with steep red roofs and nets spread in the sun. Mindful of his search, Carter questioned all the mariners closely about those whom they had met in the taverns of Cepheus, asking the names and the ways of the strange men with long and narrow eyes, long-lobed ears, thin noses, and pointed chins, who came from dark ships in the north, and traded onyx for the carved jade and spun gold with the little red singing birds of Cepheus. Of these men the sailors knew not much, and save that they had talked but seldom, and spread a kind of awe about them. Their land was very far away, and was called Inganok, and not many people cared to go there, because it was a cold twilight land, and was said to be close to unpleasant Lang, although high impassable mountains towered on the side where Lang was thought to lie, so that none may say whether this evil plateau with its horrible stone villages and unmentionable monastery were really there, or whether the rumor were only a fear that timid people felt in the night when formidable barrier peaks loomed black in the night against a rising moon. Certainly, men reached Lang from very different oceans. Of other boundaries of Inganok, where sailors had no notion, nor had they heard of the cold waste and unknown Kadath, save from a vague, unplaced report. And of the marvelous Sunset City which Carter sought, they knew nothing at all. So, the traveler asked no more of far things, but bided his time, till he might talk with those strange men from cold and twilight Inganok, who are the seed of such gods as carved from their features in Agronic. IPA and cork juice. Sounds like a good time. Late in the day, the galleon had reached those bends on the river which traversed the perfumed jungles of Cled. Here, Carter wished that he might disembark, for in those tropic tangles sleep wondrous palaces of ivory, lone and unbroken, where once dwelt the fabulous monarchs of land, whose name is forgotten. Carter spells of the Elder Ones keep those places unharmed and undecayed. For it is written that there may one day be a need of them again, and elephant caravans have glimpsed them from afar by the moonlight, though none dares approach them closely because of the guardians to which their wholeness is due. But the ship swept on, and dusk hushed the hum of the day, and the first stars above blinked answers to early fireflies on the banks as that jungle fell far behind, leaving only its fragrance as a memory that had been. And all through the night, that galleon floated on past mysteries unseen and unsuspected. Once a lookout reported fires on the hills to the east, but the sleepy captain said that they had better not be looked at too much, since it was highly uncertain just who or what had lit them. In the morning, the river had broadened out greatly, and Carter saw by houses along the banks that they were close to the rugged granite, and the houses peaked fantastic with beamed and plastered gables. The men of Hlanith are more like those of the waking world than the others in the dreamland, so that the city is not sought except for barter, but is prized for the solid work of its artisans. The wharves of Hlanith are of oak, and there is a galleon made fast while the captain traded in the taverns. Carter also went ashore and looked curiously upon the rutted streets where wooden ox carts lumbered and feverish merchants cried their wares vacuously into the bazaars. The sea taverns were all close to the wharves in the cobbled lanes salted with the spray of the high tides, and seemed exceedingly ancient with their low, black-beamed ceilings and casements of greenish bull's-eye panes. Ancient sailors in the taverns talked much of distant ports, and told many stories of the curious men from the twilight Inganok, but had little to add to what the sea folk of the galleon had told. Then, at last, after much unloading, the ship had set off to sail once more over the sunset sea, and the high walls and gables of Hlanith grew less as the last golden light of day lent them a wonder and beauty beyond any that men had given them. Sorry, just a moment. Two nights and 2 days the galleon sailed over the Cenarian Sea, sighting no land and speaking but one other vessel. Then, near sunset of the second day, there loomed up ahead the snowy peak of Iran, with its ginkgo trees swaying on the lower slopes, and Carter knew that they were come to the land of Uth Nargai, in the marvelous city of Cepheus. Swiftly there came into sight the glittering minarets of that fabulous town, and the untarnished marble walls with their bronze statues, and the great stone bridge where Naraksa joins the sea. Then rose the green gentle hills behind the town, with their groves and gardens of asphodels and the small shrines and cottages upon them, and far in the background the purple ridge of the Tenarians, potent and mystical, behind them which lay forbidden ways in the waking world and toward other regions of dream. The harbor was full of painted galleys, some of which were from marble cloud city of Seranian, which lies in the ethereal space beyond where sea meets the sky, and some of which were from substantial ports on the oceans of the dreamland. Among these, the steersmen threaded their way up to the spice-fragrant wharves, where the galleon made fast in the dark and dusk as the city's million lights began to twinkle out over the water. Ever new seemed the deathless city of vision, for here time has no power to tarnish or destroy. As it has always been, is still the turquoise of Noth Hornoth, and the 80 orchid-wreathed priests are the same who builded, that's an error, who built it 10,000 years ago. Shining still is the bronze of the great gates, nor are their onyx pavements ever worn or broken. And the great bronze statues on the walls look down on merchants and camel drivers older than fable, yet without one gray hair in their forked beards. Carter did not at once seek out the temple or the palace of the citadel, but stayed by the seaward, while among the traders and sailors. And when it was too late for rumors and legends, he sought out an ancient tavern he knew well, and rested with dreams of the gods on unknown Kadath, whom he had sought. The next day he searched all along the quays for some stranger mariners of Inganok, but was told that none were now in port, their galley not being due from north for 2 weeks. He found, however, one Thorbonian sailor who had been to Inganok and had worked in the onyx quarries of that twilight place. And this sailor said there was certainly a desert to the north of the peopled region, which everybody seemed to fear and shun. The Thorbonian opined that this desert led around the utmost rim of impassable peaks into Lang's horrible plateau, and that this was why men feared it, though he admitted there were other vague tales of evil presences and nameless sentinels. Whether or not this could be the fabled waste where an unknown Kadath stands, he did not know, but it seemed unlikely that those presences and sentinels, if needed, truly existed, and were stationed for naught. On the following day, Carter walked up the street of the pillars to the turquoise temple and talked to the high priest. Though Noth Horthoth is chiefly worshipped in the Cepheus, all the great ones are mentioned in the diurnal prayers, and the priest was reasonably versed in their moods. Like a tall and distant Othar, he strongly advised against any attempt to see them, declaring that they are testy and capricious, and subject to strange protection from the mindless other gods from the outside, whose soul and messenger is the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep. Their jealous hiding of the marvelous Sunset City showed clearly that they did not wish Carter to reach it, and it is doubtful how they would regard a guest whose object was to see them and plead before them. No man had ever found Kadath in the past, and it might just be that none ever found it in the future. Such rumors as they were told about the Onyx Castle of the Great Ones were not by any means reassuring. Having thanked the orchid-crowned high priest, Carter left the temple and sought the bazaar of the sheep butchers, where the old chief of Cepheus' cats dwelt sleek and contented. That gray and dignified being was sunning himself on the onyx pavement, and extended a languid paw as his caller approached, but when Carter repeated the passwords and introductions furnished to him by the old cat General and Ulthar, the furry patriarch became very cordial and communicative, and told much of the secret lore known to cats in the seaward slopes of Uthnargai. Best of all, he repeated several things told him furtively by the timid waterfront cats of Cepheus about the men of Inganok, on whose dark ship no cat will go. It seems that these men have an aura not of earth about them, though that is not the reason why no cat will sail on their ships. The reason for this is that Inganok holds shadows which no cat can endure, so that in all the cold twilight realm there is never a cheering purr or homely mew. Whether it be because of the things wafted over impossible peaks from hypothetical Lang, or because of the things filtering down from the chilly desert to the north, none may say. But it remains a fact that in that far land there broods a hint of outer space which cats do not like, and to which they are more sensitive than men. Therefore, they will not go into the dark ships that seek the basalt quays of Inganok. The old chief of the cats also told him where to find his friend, King Kuarns, who, in Carter's latter dreams, they had reigned alternately in the rose crystal palace of the 70 Delights at Cepheus, and in turreted cloud castle of sky-floating Serenian. It seems that he could no more find the content in the palaces, but had formed a mighty longing to see English cliffs and downlands of his boyhood, where in well-dreaming villages England's old songs hover at evening behind lattice windows, and where grey church towers peep lovely through the verdure of distant valleys. He could not go back to these things in the waking world, because his body was dead, but he had done the next best thing, and dreamed a small tract of such countryside in the region east of the city, where meadows roll gracefully up from the sea cliffs to the foot of the Tenarian hills. There dwelt a grey Gothic manor house of stone, looking upon the sea, and tried to think it was ancient Trevor Towers, where he was born, and where 13 generations of his forefathers had first seen light. And on the coast nearby, he had built a little Cornish fishing village, with steep cobbled ways, settling therein such people as he had the most English faces, and seeking ever to teach them the dear remembered accents of old Cornwall fishers. And in a valley not far off, he had reared a great Norman abbey, whose towers he could see from his window, placing around it in churchyard grey stones with the names of his ancestors carved thereon, and with moss somewhat of old England's moss. For though Kuarns was a monarch in the land of dream, with all imagined pomps and marvels, splendors and beauties, ecstasies and delights, novelties and excitements at his command, he would gladly have resigned forever the whole of his power and luxury and freedom for one blessed day as a simple boy in that pure and quiet England, that ancient beloved England which had molded his being and of which he must have always be immutably a part. So, when Carter bade that the old grey chief of the cats adieu, he did not seek the terraced palace of the rose crystal, but walked out the eastern gate and across the daisied fields toward a peaked gable which he glimpsed through the oaks of a park sloping up to the sea cliffs. And in time he came to a great hedge and the gate with a little brick lodge, and when he rang the bell there hobbled to admit him no robed and anointed lackey of the palace, but a small, stubbly old man in a smock, who spoke as best he could in the quaint tones of far Cornwall. And Carter walked up the shady path toward the trees as near possible to England's trees, and climbed the terraces among the gardens set out into the Queen Anne's time. At the door, flanked by stone cats in the old way, he was met by a whiskered butler in suitable livery, and was presently taken to the library where Crons, Lord of Uth-Nargai, and the sky around Sir Ninian sat passive in a chair by the window, looking on his little sea-coast village, and wishing that his old nurse would come in and scold him, because he was not ready for that hateful lawn party at the vicar's, with the carriage waiting, and his mother nearly out of patience. Crons, clad in a dressing gown of the sort favored by London tailors in his youth, rose eagerly to meet his guest, for the sight of an Anglo-Saxon from the waking world was very dear to him. Oh, sorry, I just realized that the logo was still up. I got carried away. Sorry. Okay. Even if it was a Saxon from Boston, Massachusetts, instead of from Cornwall, and for long they talked of old times, having much to say because both were old dreamers and well versed in the wonders of incredible places. Crons, indeed, had been out beyond the stars in ultimate void, and was said to be the only one who had ever returned sane from such a voyage. At length, Carter brought up the subject of his quest, and asked of his host those questions he had asked so many others. Crons did not know where Kadath was, or the marvelous Sunset City, but he did know that the Great Ones were very dangerous creatures to seek out, and that the other gods had strange ways of protecting them from impertinent curiosity. He had learned much of the other gods in distant parts of space, especially in that region where form does not exist, and colored gases study the innermost secrets. The violet gas Signac had told him terrible things of that crawling chaos Nyarlathotep, and had warned him never to approach the central void, where the demon Sultan Azathoth gnaws hungrily in the dark. Altogether, it was not well to meddle with the Elder Ones, but if they persistently denied all access to the marvelous Sunset City, it were better not to seek that city. Crons furthermore doubted whether his guest would profit aught by coming to the city, even were he to gain it. He himself had dreamed and yearned long years for lovely Cepheus in the land of Uth-Nargai, and for the freedom and color of high experience of life devoid of its chains, conventions, and stupidities. But now that he was to come into that city, in that land, and was the king thereof, he found the freedom and the vividness all too soon worn out, and monotonous for want of linkage with anything firm in his feelings and memories. He was a king of Uth-Nargai, but found no meaning therein, and drooped always for the old familiar things of England that had shaped his youth. All his kingdom would give him for the sound of Cornish church bells over the downs, and all the thousand minarets of Cepheus for the steep, homely roofs of the village near his home. So he told his guests that the unknown Sunset City might not hold quite the content he sought, and that perhaps it had been better remain a glorious and half-remembered dream. For he had visited Carter often in the old waking days, and knew well the lovely New England slopes that had given him birth. At last he was very certain the seeker would long only for the early remembered scenes, the glow of Beacon Hill at evening, the tall steeples and winding hill streets of quaint Kingsport, the hoary gambrel roofs of ancient and witch-haunted Arkham, and the blessed miles of meads and valleys where stone walls rambled and white farmhouse gables peeped out from bowers of verdure. These things he told Randolph Carter, but still the seeker held to the purpose, and in the end they parted each with his own conviction, and Carter went back through the bronze gate into Cepheus and down the street of pillars to the old sea wall, where he talked more with the mariners of far parts and waited for the dark ship from cold and twilight Inganock, whose strange faces, sailors, and onyx traders had in them the blood of the great ones. One starlight evening, when the Faroes shone splendid over the harbor, the longed-for ship put in. The strange-faced sailors and traders appeared one by one, and group by group in the ancient taverns along the sea wall. It was very exciting to see again those living faces so like the godlike features on Negronic. But Carter did not hasten to speak with the silent sea folk. He did not know how much pride and secrecy and dim supernal memory might fill those children of the great ones, and was sure it would not be wise to tell them of his quest or ask too closely of that cold desert stretching north of the twilight land. They talked little with other folk in ancient sea taverns, but would gather in groups in remote corners and sing among themselves the haunting airs of unknown places, or chant long tales to one another in accents alien to the rest of the dreamland. And so rare and moving were the airs and tales that one might guess the wonders from faces of those who listened, even though the words came to common ears only as strange cadence and obscure melody. For a week, the strange sea folk lingered in the taverns and traded in the bazaars of Cepheus. And before they sailed, Carter had taken the passage on their dark ship, telling them that he was an old onyx miner and wishful to work in their quarries. That ship was very lovely and cunningly wrought, being of teak wood, with ebony fittings and traceries of gold. And the cabin in which the traveler lodged had hangings of silk and velvet. One morning, at the turn of the tide, the sails were raised and the anchor lifted, and Carter stood on the high stern. He saw the sunrise blazing, and walls and statues and golden minarets of ageless Cepheus sink into the distance. And the snowy peak of Mount Iran grew smaller and smaller. By noon, there was nothing in sight save the gentle blue of the Cernarian Sea, with one painted galley afar off bound for a cloud-hung realm of Cernarian where the sea meets the sky. And night came with gorgeous stars, and the dark ship steered for Charles Wayne and the Little Bear. As they swung slowly around the pole, and the sailors sang strange songs of unknown places, and then stole off one by one to the forecastle, where the wistful watchers murmured old chants and leaned over the rail to glimpse the luminous fish playing in the bowers beneath the sea. Carter went to sleep at midnight. And rose in the glow of a young morning, marking that the sun seemed farther south than its wont. And all through that second day he made progress in knowing that the men of the ship, getting them little by little to talk of their cold twilight land, of their exquisite onyx city, and of their fear of the high and impassable peaks beyond which Lang was said to be. They told him how sorry they were that no cats would stay in the land of Inganok, and how they thought that the hidden nearness of Lang was to blame for it. Only of the stony desert to the north they would not talk. There was something disquieting about that desert, and it was thought expedient not to admit its existence. On later days, they talked of the quarries which Carter said he was going to work. There were many of them, for all the city of Inganok was built of onyx, whilst great polished blocks of it were traded in Renar, Ogrothan, and Cepheus, and at home with the merchants of Thra, Ilarnik, and Kadarathon. For the beautiful wares of the fabulous ports, and far to the north, almost that in cold desert whose existence the men of Inganok did not care to admit, there was an unused quarry greater than all the rest, from which had been hewn in forgotten times such prodigious lumps and blocks that the sight of their chiseled vacancies struck terror to all who behold it. Who had mined those incredible blocks, and whether they had been transported, no man might say, but it was thought best not to trouble that quarry, around which such inhuman memories might conceivably cling. So it was left all alone in the twilight, with only the raven and the rumored shantak bird to brood on its immensities. When Carter heard of this quarry, he was moved to deep thought, for he knew from old tales that the Great One's castle atop unknown Kadath is of onyx. Each day the sun wheeled lower and lower into the sky, and the mist overhead grew thicker and thicker, and in 2 weeks there was not any sunlight at all, but only the weird gray twilight shining through a dome of eternal cloud by day, and a cold, starless phosphorescence from the underside of that cloud by night. On the 20th day, a great jagged rock in the sea was sighted from afar, and the first land glimpsed since Iran's snowy peak had dwindled behind the ship. Carter asked the captain the name of that rock, but he was told that it had no name and had never been sought by any vessel because of the sounds that come from it at night. And when, after dark, a dull and ceaseless howling arose from that jagged granite place, the traveler was glad that no stop had been made, and that the rock had no name. The sea folk prayed and chanted till the noise was out of earshot, and Carter dreamed terrible dreams within dreams in the small hours. 2 mornings after that, there loomed far ahead into the east a line of great peaks whose tops were lost in the changeless clouds and of that twilight world. And at the sight of them, the sailors sang glad songs, and some knelt down on the deck to pray, so that Carter knew they were come to the land of Inganok and would soon be moored to the basalt quays of the great town bearing the land's name. Toward noon, a dark coastline appeared, and before 3 o'clock there stood out against the north the bulbous domes and fantastic spires of the onyx city. Rare and curious did that archaic city rise above the walls and quays, all the delicate black, with scrolls, flutings, and arabesques of inlaid gold. Tall and many-windowed were the houses, and carved on every side with flowers and patterns whose dark symmetrics dazzled the eye with beauty, more poignant than light. Some ended in swelling domes that tapered to a point, others in terraced pyramids whereon rose clustered minarets, displaying every phase of strangeness and imagination. The walls were low, pierced by frequent gates, each under a great arch rising high above the general level, and capped by the head of a god chiseled with the same skill displayed in the monstrous face on distant Negronic. On a hill in the center rose a 16-angled tower, greater than all the rest, and bearing a high pinnacled belfry, resting on a flattened dome. This, the sea folk said, was the temple of the Elder Ones, and was ruled by an old high priest, sad with inner secrets. At intervals, the clang of a strange bell shivered over the onyx city, answered each time by a peal of mystic music made up of horns, viols, and chanting voices. And from a row of tripods on a gallery rose the high dome of the temple. There burst flares of flame at certain moments, for the priests and the people of that city were wise in the primal mysteries, and faithful in keeping the rhythms of the great ones as set forth in the scrolls older than the Panotic manuscripts. As the ship rowed past the great basalt breakwater into the harbor, the lesser noises of the city grew manifest, and Carter saw the slaves, sailors, and merchants on the docks. The sailors and merchants were of the strange-faced race of the gods, but the slaves were squat folk, said by rumor to have drifted somehow around the impassable peaks and from valleys beyond Lang. The wharves reached wide around the city and bore upon them all manner of merchandise from the galleys anchored there, while one end were great piles of onyx, both carved and uncarved, awaiting shipment to the far markets of Renar, O'Grothan, and Cepheus. It was not yet evening when the dark ship anchored beside the jutting quay of stone, and all the sailors and traders filed ashore and through the arched gate into the city. The streets of that city were paved with onyx, and some of them were wide and straight, whilst others were crooked and narrow. The houses near the water were lower than the rest, and bore above their curiously arched doorways certain signs of gold, said to be in honor of the respective small gods that favored each. The captain of the ship took Carter to an old sea tavern, where flocked the mariners of quaint countries, and promised that he would next day show him the wonders of the Twilight City, and lead him to the taverns of the onyx miners by the northern wall. And evening fell, and the little bronze lamps were lighted, and the sailors in that tavern sang songs of remote places. But when from its high tower the great bell shivered over the city, and the peal of the horns and viols and voices rose cryptical in answer thereto, all ceased their songs or tales and bowed silent till the last echo died away. For there is a wonder and a strangeness on the twilight city of Inganok, and the men fear to be lax in its rites, lest a doom and vengeance lurk unsuspectedly close. Far in the shadows of that tavern, Carter saw a squat form he did not like, for it was unmistakably that of the old, slant-eyed merchant he had been so long before in the taverns of Dilathleen, who was reputed to trade with the horrible stone villages of Lang, which no healthy folk visit, and whose evil fires are seen at night from afar, and even to have dealt with the high priest not to be described, which wears a yellow silken mask over his face and dwells all alone in a prehistoric stone monastery. This man had seemed to shew a queer gleam of knowing when Carter asked the traders of Dilathleen about the cold waste of Kadath. And somehow his presence in the dark and haunted Inganok, so close to the wonders of the north, was not a reassuring thing. He slipped wholly out of sight before Carter could speak to him. The sailors later said he had come with a yak caravan from some point not well determined, bearing the colossal and rich-flavored eggs of the rumored Shontak bird, to trade for the dexterous jade goblets that merchants brought from Ilarnik. On the following morning, the ship captain led Carter through the onyx streets of Inganok, dark under the twilight sky. There inlaid doors and figured house fronts, carven balconies, and crystal-paned oriels, all gleamed with a somber and polished loveliness, and now and then a plaza would open out with black pillars, colonnades, and statues of curious beings, both human and fabulous. Some of the vistas down long and unbending streets, or through side alleys and over bulbous domes, spires, and arabesqued roofs, were weird and beautiful beyond words. And nothing was more splendid than the massive height of the great central temple of the Elder Ones, with 16 carven sides, its flattened dome, and lofty pinnacled belfry, overtopping all else, the majestic whatever in its foreground. And always to the east, far beyond the city walls, in leagues of pasture land, rose the gaunt, gray sides of those topless and impassable peaks, across which hideous Lang is said to lie. The captain took Carter to the mighty temple, which is set with walled garden around the great plaza, whence the streets go as spokes from the wheel's hub. The 7 arched gates of that garden, each having their own carven face, like those on the city gates, are always open, and the people roam reverently at will down the tiled paths and through the low lanes lined with grotesque termini and the shrines of modest gods. And there are fountains, pools, and basins there to reflect the frequent blaze of the tripods on the high balcony, all of the onyx, and having in them small luminous fish taken by divers from the lowest bowers of the ocean. When the deep clang from the temple belfry shivers over the garden and in the city, and the answer of the horns and viols and voices peals out from 7 lodges by the garden gates, there issue from the 7 doors of the temple long columns of masked, hooded priests in black, bearing at arm's length before them great bowls from which a curious steam rises. And all the 7 columns strut peculiarly in single file, legs thrown far forward without bending the knees, down the walks that lead down 7 lodges, wherein they disappear and do not appear again. It is said the subterranean paths connect the lodges with the temple, and that the long files of priests return through them, nor is it unwhispered that deep flights of onyx go down the mysteries that are never told. But only a few are those who hint that the priests in the masked, hooded columns are not human priests. Carter did not enter the temple because none but the veiled king is permitted to do that. But before he left the garden, the hour of the bell came, and he had heard the shivering clang deafeningly above him, and the wailing of the horns and voles and voices loud from the lodges of the gates. And down the 7 great walks stalked the long files of bowl-bearing priests in their singular way, giving to the traveler a fear which human priests do not often give. When the last of them had vanished, he left the garden, noting as he did so a spot on the pavement over which the bulls had passed. Even the ship captain did not like that spot, and hurried him on towards the hill whereon the veiled king's palace rises many-domed and marvelous. The ways to the onyx palace are steep and narrow, all but that broad curving one where the king and his companions ride on yaks or in yak-drawn chariots. Carter and his guide climbed up an alley that was all steps, between inlaid walls bearing strange signs in gold, and under balconies and oriels whence sometimes floated soft strains of music or breaths of exotic fragrance. Always ahead loomed those Titan walls, mighty buttresses, and clustered in bulbous domes, for which the veiled king's palace was famous. And at length they passed under a great black arch and emerged in the gardens of the monarch's pleasure. There Carter paused in faintness at so much beauty, for the onyx terraces and colonnaded walks, the gay parterres and delicate flowering trees, espalled to golden lattices, and brazen urns with tripods with cunning bas-reliefs, the pedestaled and almost breathing statues of veined black marble, and basalt-bottomed lagoons, and tiled fountains with luminous fish, the tiny temples of iridescent singing birds atop carved columns, the marvelous scrollwork of the great bronze gates, and the blossoming vines trained along every inch of the polished walls, all joined to form a singular sight whose loveliness was beyond reality, and half fabulous even in the land of dream. There it shimmered like a vision, under that gray twilight sky, with the domed and fretted magnificence of the palace ahead, and the fantastic silhouette of the distant, impassable peaks on the right. And ever the small birds in the fountain sang, while the perfume and rare blossoms spread like a veil over the incredible garden. No other human presence was here, and Carter was glad it was so. Then they turned and descended against the onyx alley of steps, for the palace itself no visitor may enter, and it is not well to look long and steadily into the great central dome, since it is said to house the archaic father of all rumored shoutout birds, and to lend out queer dreams to the curious. After that, the captain took Carter to the north quarter of the town, near the gate of caravans, where the taverns of the yak merchants and onyx miners, and there, in a low sealed inn of quarrymen, they said farewell, for business called to the captain, whilst Carter was eager to talk with the miners about the north. There was many men in that inn, and the traveler was not long in speaking to some of them, saying that he was an old miner of onyx, and anxious to know somewhat of Inganok's quarries, but all that he learned was not much more than he knew before, for the miners were timid and evasive about the cold desert to the north, and the quarry that no man visits. They held fears of fabled emissaries from around the mountains where Wang is said to lie, and the evil presences and nameless sentinels far north among the scattered rocks. And they whispered about the rumored shoutout birds are no wholesome things, it being indeed for the best that no man has ever truly seen, for that fabled father of shoutouts is the king's dome is fed in the dark. The next day, saying that he wished to look over all the various mines for himself, and visit the scattered farms and quaint onyx villages of Inganok, Carter hired a yak and stuffed the great leathern saddlebags for a journey. Beyond the gate of the caravans, the road lay straight betwixt tilled fields, with many odd farmhouses crowned by low domes. At some of these houses, the seeker stopped to ask questions, once finding a host so austere and reticent, and so full of unplaced majesty, like to that in the huge features of Negronic, that he felt certain that he had come at last upon one of the great old ones themselves, or upon one of full 9/10 of their blood, dwelling amongst men. And to that austere and reticent Carter, he was careful to speak very well of the gods, and to praise all blessings they had ever accorded him. That night, Carter camped in the roadside meadow beneath a great ligath tree to which he had tied his yak, and in the morning resumed his northward pilgrimage. At about 10 o'clock, he reached a small domed village of Urg, where traders rest and miners tell their tales, and paused in its taverns till noon. It is here that the great caravan road turns west towards Ceylon, but Carter kept on north by a quarry road. All the afternoon he followed that rising road, which was somewhat narrower than the great highway, and which now led through a region with more rocks than tiled fields. And by evening the low hills on his left had risen into sizable black cliffs, so that he knew he was very close to the mining country. All the while the great gaunt sides of the impassable mountains towered far off to his right, and the further he went, the worse tales he heard from them on the scattered farmers and traders and drivers of lumbering onyx carts along the way. On the second night, he camped in the shadow of a large black crag, tethering his yak to a stake driven to the ground. He observed the greater phosphorescence of the clouds at this northerly point, and more than once he thought he saw dark shapes outlined against them. And on the third morning he came in sight of the first onyx quarry, and greeted the men who there labored with picks and chisels. Before evening he had passed 11 quarries, the land being here given over altogether to onyx cliffs and boulders, with no vegetation at all, but only great rocky fragments scattered about a floor of black earth, with the gray impassable peaks always rising gaunt and sinister on his right. The third night he spent at a camp of quarrymen whose flickering fires cast weird reflections on the polished cliffs to the west. And they sang many songs and told many tales, shewing such strange knowledge of the olden days and the habits of gods that Carter could see he had many latent memories of their sires, the great ones. They asked him whither he went, and cautioned him to not go far to the north, but he replied that he was seeking new cliffs of onyx and would take no more risks than were common among prospectors. In the morning he bade them adieu and rode on to the darkening north, where they had warned him he would find the feared and unvisited quarry, whence the hands over the men's hands had wrenched prodigious blocks. But he did not like it when, turning back to wave at last farewell, he thought he saw approaching the camp that squat and evasive old merchant, with eyes whose conjectured traffic with Lang was the gossip of distant Dilathaline. Gets a little bit uncomfortable to sit up all the time. I'm gonna see if I can actually I'm gonna test something out real quick. This is much better. I feel much more comfortable. Now I have back support. Okay, sorry, I lost my place. Okay. After 2 more quarries, the inhabited part of Inganock seemed to end, and the road narrowed to a steeply rising yak path among forbidding black cliffs. Along the right towered a gaunt and distant peaks, and as Carter climbed farther and farther into this untraversed realm, he found it grew darker and colder. Soon, he perceived that there would be no other prints of feet, no hooves on the black path beneath, and realized he had indeed come into a strange and deserted ways of the elder time. Once in a while, a raven would croak far overhead, and now and then a flapping behind some vast rock would make him think uncomfortably of the rumored shoutout bird. Sorry, I need to make more adjustments. Keep losing my place. Okay, sorry. But in the main, he was alone with a shaggy steed, and troubled him to observe that his excellent yak had become more and more reluctant to advance, and more disposed to snort affrightedly at any small noise along this route. The path now contracted between sable and glistening walls, and began to display an even greater steepness than before. It was a bad footing, and the yak often slipped on the stony fragments strewn thickly about. In 2 hours, Carter saw ahead a definite crest, beyond which was nothing but dull gray sky, and blessed the prospect of a level or downward course. To reach this crest, however, was no easy task, for the way had grown nearly perpendicular, and was perilous with those loose black gravel and small stones. Eventually, Carter dismounted and led his dubious yak, pulling very hard when the animal balked or stumbled, and keeping his own footing as best he might get. Then, suddenly, he came to the top and saw beyond, and gasped at what he saw. The path indeed led straight ahead and slightly down, with the same lines of high at natural walls as before, but on the left there was something open in a monstrous space, vast acres in extent, where some archaic power had riven and rent the native cliffs of onyx in the form of a giant's quarry. Far back into the solid precipice ran that cyclopean gouge, and deep down within earth's bowels its lower delvings yawned. It was no quarry of man, but the concave sides were scarred with great squares yards wide, and told of the size of blocks that were once hewn by nameless hands and chisels. High over its jagged rim huge ravens flapped and croaked, and vague whirrings of the unseen depths told of bats or warhogs, or less mentionable presences, haunting the endless blackness. There, Carter stood in a narrow way amidst the twilight, with the rocky path sloping down before him, tall onyx cliffs on his right that led as far as he could see, and tall cliffs on the left chopped off just ahead to make that terrible and unearthly quarry. All at once, the yaks uttered a cry and burst from his control, leaping past him and darting on in a panic till it vanished down the narrow slope toward the north. Stones, kicked by its flying hooves, fell over the brink of the quarry and lost themselves in the dark without any sound of the striking bottom. But Carter ignored the perils of that scanty path as he raced breathlessly after the flying steed. Soon, the left-hand cliffs resumed their course, making the way once more a narrow lane. And still, the traveler leaped on after the yak, whose great wide prints told of its desperate flight. Once, he thought he had heard the hoofbeats of the frightened beast, and doubled his speed from this encouragement. He was covering miles, and little by little, the way was broadening in front till he knew he must soon emerge on the cold, dreaded desert from the north. The gaunt gray flanks of the distant impassable peaks were once again visible above the right-hand crags, and ahead were the rocks and boulders of an open space which was clearly a foretaste of the dark and limitless plain. And once more, those hoofbeats sounded in his ears, plainer than before, but this time giving terror instead of encouragement, because he realized that they were not the frightened hoofbeats of the fleeing yak. These beats were ruthless and purposeful, and they were behind him. Carter's pursuit of the yak became now a flight from an unseen thing. For, though he dared not glance over his shoulder, he felt that the presence behind him could be nothing wholesome or mentionable. His yak must have heard it or felt it first, and he did not like to ask himself whether or not it followed him from the haunts of men or had floundered up about the black quarry. Meanwhile, the cliffs had seemed left behind, so that the oncoming night fell over a great waste of sand and spectral rocks, wherein all paths were lost. He could not see the hoofprints of his yak, but always from behind him came that detestable clopping, mingled now and then with what he fancied were titanic flappings and whirrings. That he was losing ground seemed unhappily clear to him, and he knew he had hopelessly lost in this broken and blasted desert of meaningless rocks and untraveled sands. Only those remote and impassable peaks on the right gave him any sense of direction. Even they were less clear as the gray twilight waned and the sickly phosphorescence of the clouds took its place. Then, dim and misty in the darkening north, before him he glimpsed a terrible thing. He had thought it for some moments a range of black mountains, but now he saw it. It was something more. The phosphorescence of the brewing clouds showed it plainly, and even silhouetted parts of it, low vapors glow behind. How distant it was, he could not tell, but it must have been very far. It was thousands of feet high, stretching in a great concave arc from the gray, impassable peaks to the unimagined westward spaces. He had once indeed been a ridge of mighty onyx hills, but now those hills were no more, for some hand greater than man's had touched them. Silent, they squatted there atop the world like wolves or ghouls, crowned with clouds, mists, and guarding the secrets of the north forever. All in a great half-circle they squatted, those dog-like mountains carven into monstrous watching statues, and their right hands were raised to menace against mankind. It was only the flickering light of the clouds that made their mitered double heads seem to move. But as Carter stumbled upon them, he saw arise from their shadowy laps great forms whose motions were no delusion, winged and whirring. Those forms grew larger each moment, and the traveler knew his stumbling was at an end. They were not any birds or bats known elsewhere on Earth or in Dreamland, for they were larger than elephants and had heads like a horse's. Carter knew that they must be the Shontak birds of ill rumor, and wondered no more what evil guardians and nameless sentinels made men avoid the boreal rock desert. And as he stopped in final resignation, he dared at last to look behind him, where indeed was trotting the squat, slant-eyed traitor of evil legend, grinning astride a lean yak, and leading on a noxious horde of leering Shontaks, to whose wings still clung the rime and niter of the nether pits. Trapped though he was by fabulous hippocephalic winged nightmares that pressed around in great unholy circles, Carter did not lose consciousness. Lofty and horrible those titan gargoyles above him towered, while the slant-eyed merchant leapt down from his yak and stood grinning before the captive. The man motioned Carter to mount one of the repugnant Shontaks, helping him up as his judgment struggled with his loathing. It was his hard work ascending, for the Shontak bird has scales instead of feathers, and these scales are very slippery. Once he was seated, the slant-eyed man hopped up behind him, leaving the lean yak to be led away northward toward the ring of the carven mountains by one of the incredible bird colossi. There now followed a hideous whirl through the frigid space, endlessly and eastward toward the gaunt gray flanks of those impassable mountains beyond which Lang was said to lie. Far above the clouds they flew, till at last there lay beneath them those fabled summits which the folk of Inganok had never seen, and which lie always in high vortices of gleaming mist. Carter beheld them very plainly as they gathered below, and saw upon their topmost peaks strange caves which made him think of those on Negronic. But he did not question his captor about these things when he noticed that both the man and the horse-headed Shontak appeared oddly fearful of them, hurrying past nervously and showing great tension until they were left far in the rear. The Shantak now flew lower, revealing beneath the canopy a cloud of gray, barren plain, whereon great distances shone little feeble fires. As they descended, there appeared at intervals lone huts of granite in bleak stone villages, whose tiny windows glowed with pallid light. And there came from those huts and villages a shrill droning of pipes and nauseous rattle of crotala, which proved at once that Inganok's people are right in their geographic rumors. For travelers have heard such sounds before, and know they float only from the cold desert plateau, which healthy folk never visit. That haunted place of evil and mystery which is lying. Around the feeble fires, dark forms were dancing, and Carter was curious as to what the manner of things might be. For no healthy folk have ever been to Lang, and the place is known only by the fires and stone huts as seen very afar. Very slowly and awkwardly did the forms leap, and with an insane twisting and bending not good to behold, so that Carter did not wonder at the monstrous evil imputed to them by vague legend, or the fear in which all dreamland holds their abhorrent frozen plateau. As the Shantak flew closer, the repulsiveness of the dancers became tangled with a certain hellish familiarity, and the prisoner kept straining his eyes and racking his memory for clues to where he had seen such creatures before. They leapt as though they had hooves instead of feet, and seemed to wear a sort of wig or headpiece with small horns. Of other clothing they had none, but most of them were quite furry. Behind they had dwarfish tails, and when they glanced upward he saw excessive width of their mouths. Then he knew what they were, and that they did not wear any wigs or headpieces after all. For the cryptic folk of Lang were one of race with the uncomfortable merchants of the black galleys that traded rubies at Dilath Lane, those not quite human merchants who were the slaves of the monstrous moon things. They were indeed the same folk who had shanghaied Carter onto the noisome galley so long ago, and whose kith he had seen driven in herds about the unclean wharves of the accursed lunar city, with the leaner ones trolling and the fatter ones taken away in crates for the needs of the polypus and amorphous masters. Now he saw where such ambiguous creatures had come from, and shuddered at the thought that Lang must be known to those formless abominations from the moon. But the Shantak flew past the trees, and the stone huts, and the less than human dancers, and soared over the sterile hills of gray granite and dim wastes of rock and ice and snow. Day came, and the phosphorescence of low clouds gave a place to the misty twilight of the northern world, and still the vile bird winged meaningly through the cold silence. At times the man talked with his steed in a hateful and guttural language. The Shantak would answer with tittering tones that rasped like the scratching of ground glass. All the while the land was getting higher, and finally they came to a windswept tableland which seemed to the very roof of a blasted and tenantless world. There, all alone in the hush, in the dusk, in the cold, rose the uncouth stones of squat, windowless buildings, around which a circle of crude monoliths stood, and all this arrangement, there was nothing human, and Carter surmised from the old tales that there was indeed come a most dreadful and legendary and remote prehistoric monastery, wherein dwells uncompanioned the high priest not to be described, which wears a yellow silken mask over his face, in praise to the other gods, in their crawling chaos, Nyarlathotep. The loathsome bird now settled to the ground, and the man hopped down and helped his captive alight. Of purpose of his seizure, Carter now felt very sure, for clearly the merchant was an agent of darker powers, eager to drag before his masters a mortal whose presumption had aimed at the finding of unknown Kadath and the saying of a prayer before faces of the great ones in their onyx castle. It seemed likely that this merchant had caused his former capture by the slaves of the moon things of Dilathleen, and that he now meant to do what the rescuing cats had baffled, taking the victim to some dread rendezvous in the monstrous Nyarlathotep, and telling with that boldness the seeking of the unknown Kadath had been tried. Lying in the cold waste north of Inganok must be close to the other gods, and there the passes to Kadath were well guarded. The slant-eyed man was small, but the great hippocephalic bird was there to see he was obeyed. So Carter followed where he was led, and passed within a circle of standing rocks and into a low arched doorway of the windowless stone monastery. There were no lights inside, but the evil merchant, with a small clay lamp bearing morbid bas-reliefs, and prodded his prisoner onto the mazes of a narrow winding corridor. On the walls of the corridor were painted frightful scenes older than history, and in a style unknown to the archaeologists of Earth. After countless eons, their pigments were brilliant still, for the cold and dryness and hideous lang keep alive many primal things. Carter saw them fleetingly in the rays of that dim and moving lamp, and shuddered of what tale they told. Though through these archaic frescoes, Lang's animals stalked, and the horned, hooved, and wide-mouthed almost human danced evilly amidst forgotten cities. There were scenes of old wars wherein Lang's almost humans fought with the bloated purple spiders of the neighboring vales, and there were scenes also of the coming of black galleys from the moon, and of the submission of Lang's people to the polypus and amorphous blasphemies that hopped and floundered and wriggled about them, those slippery, grayish-white blasphemies they worshipped as gods, nor ever complained when scores of their best and fatted males were taken away in the black galleys. The monstrous moon beasts made their camp on the jagged side of the sea, and Carter could tell them from the frescoes that this was none other than the lone, nameless rock he had seen when sailing to Inganok, the gray, accursed rock which Inganok's sea folk shun, and from which vile howlings reverberate all through the night. And in those frescoes was shewn a great seaport, and the capital of the almost humans, proud, pillared betwixt the cliffs and the basalt wharves, and wondrous with high fanes and carven places. Great gardens and calm streets led from the cliffs, and from each of the 6 sphinx-crowned gates to a vast central plaza, and in that plaza was a pair of winged colossal lions, guarding the top of the subterranean staircase. Again and again were those huge winged lions shewn, their mighty flanks of diorite glistening in the gray twilight of the day, in the cloudy phosphorescence of the night. And as Carter stumbled past their frequent and repeated pictures, it came to him at last what indeed they were, and what city it was that the almost humans had ruled so anciently before the coming of the black galleys. There could be no mistake, for the legends of Dreamland and the generous and profuse, indubitably, the primal city was no less a place than the storied Sarcomand, whose ruins had bleached for 1,000,000 years before the first true human saw light, and whose twin titan lions guard eternally the steps that lead down from Dreamland to the great abyss. Other views showed the gray, gaunt peaks dividing Lang from Inganok, and the monstrous Shantok birds that build nests on the ledges halfway up, and they showed likewise to the curious caves near the topmost pinnacles, and how even the boldest of Shantoks fly screaming away from them. Carter had not seen those caves when he passed over them, and noticed their likeness to the caves of Necronic. Now he knew what the likeness was more than a chance one, for in the pictures were shown their loathsome and fearsome denizens, and those bat wings, curving horns, barbed tails, prehensile paws, and rubbery bodies were not strange to him. He had met those silent, flitting, and clutching creatures before, those mindless guardians of the great abyss, whom even the great ones fear, and who own not Nyarlathotep, but hoary Nodens as their lord. For they were the dreaded night gaunts, who never laugh or smile, because they have no faces, and who flop unendingly in the dark betwixt the Vale of Panath and the passes into the outer world. The slant-eyed merchant had now prodded Carter into a great domed space whose walls were carved in shocking bas-reliefs, and whose center had held a gaping circular pit surrounded by 6 malignly stained stone pillars in a ring. There was no light in this vast and evil-smelling crypt, and the small lamp of the sinister merchant shone so feebly that one could grasp details of only little by little. Sorry, I live next to a fire station, so I get the pleasure of having to hear the sirens go off almost every night. So that was one of the occasions. Sorry about that. Anyways. To this being, the slant-eyed man made certain signs with his hands, and the lurker in the dark replied by raising a disgustingly carven flute of ivory and silk-covered paws, and blowing certain loathsome sounds from beneath its flowing yellow mask. This colloquy went on for some time, and to Carter there was something sickeningly familiar in the sound of what the flute made, and the stench of the malodorous place. It made him think of a frightful red-litten city, and of the revolting procession that once filed through it, of that, and of an awful climb through the lunar countryside beyond, before the rescuing rush of Earth's friendly cats, he knew that the creature on the die was without doubt the high priest not to be described, of which legend whispers such fiendish and abnormal possibilities. But he feared to think just what the abhorred high priest might be. Then the figured silk slipped a trifle from one of the grayish-white paws, and Carter knew what the noisome high priest was, and in the hideous second stark fear drove him to something his reason would never have dared attempt, for in all his shaken consciousness there was a room only for one frantic will to escape from what squatted on that golden throne. He knew that hopeless labyrinth of stone lay betwixt him and the cold tableland outside, and that even on that tableland the noxious shoutout still waited. Yet in spite of all this, there was only his mind and the instant need to get away from that wriggling, silt-robed monstrosity. The man had set his curious lamp on some high and wickedly stained altar stones by the pit, and had moved forward somewhat to talk to the high priest with his hands. Carter, hitherto wholly passive, now gave the man a terrific push with all the wild strength of fear, so the victim toppled at once into the gaping well which rumor holds to... I just really like when people just unnecessarily rev their engines outside as if they think it's the coolest thing ever. Like, this is my personality. I make my car sound loud. I'm so cool. So obnoxious. I'm sorry. So that the victim toppled at once into the gaping well which rumor holds to reach down to the hellish vaults of Zen, where Gugs hunt gas into the dark. In almost the same second, he seized the lamp from the altar and darted into the frescoed labyrinths, racing his way in that the chance determined, and trying not to think of the stealthy padding of the shapeless paws on the stones behind him, or the silent wrigglings and crawlings which must be going on back there in lightless corridors. After a few moments, he regretted his thoughtless haste, and had wished that he tried to follow backward the frescoes that he had passed on the way in. True, they were so confused and duplicated that they could not have done him any good, but he wished none the less that he had made the attempt. Those he now saw were even more horrible than those he had then seen, and he knew he was not in the corridors waiting outside. In time, he became quite sure he was not followed, and slackened his pace somewhat, but scarce had he breathed in half relief when a new peril beset him. His lamp was waning, and he would soon be in pitch blackness with no means of sight or guidance. When the light was all gone, he groped slowly in the dark, and prayed to the great ones for such help as they might afford. At times, he felt the stone floor sloping up or down, and once he stumbled over a step which no reason seemed to exist. The farther he went, the damper it seemed to be, and when he was able to feel a junction or the mouth of a side passage, he was able to choose a way which sloped downward the least. He believed, though, that the general course was down, and the vault-like smell and incrustations on the greasy walls and floor alike warned him of the burrowing deep in Wang's unwholesome tableland. But there was not any warning of the thing which came at last, only the thing itself, with its terror and shock and breathtaking chaos. One moment he was groping slowly over a slippery floor of almost level place, and the next he was shooting dizzily downward in the dark through a burrow which must not have been well nigh vertical. Of the length of that hideous sliding he could never be sure, but it seemed to take hours of delirious nausea and ecstatic frenzy. Then he noticed he was still, with the phosphorescent clouds of the northern night shining sickly above him. All around were crumbling walls and broken columns, and the pavement on which was pierced by a straggling grass and he wrenched asunder by frequent shrubs and roots. Behind him a basalt cliff rose topless and perpendicular, its dark side sculptured into repellent scenes and pierced by arched and carven entrance to the inner blackness out of which he had come. Ahead stretched double rows of pillars and fragments and pedestals of pillars that spoke of a broad and bygone street, and from the urns and basins along the way he knew had been a great street of gardens. Far off, its end of pillars spread to the mark a vast round plaza, and in that open circle there loomed, gigantic under the lurid clouds, a pair of monstrous things. Huge winged lions of diorite they were, with blackness and shadow between them. Full 20 feet they reared their grotesque and unbroken heads, and snarled derisive on the ruins around them. And Carter knew right well what they must be, for legends tell of only one such twain. They were the chainless guardians of the great abyss, and these dark ruins were in truth primordial Sarkomand. Carter's first act was to close and barricade the archway in the cliff with fallen blocks and odd debris that lay around. He wished no follower from Wang's hateful monastery, for along the way ahead would lurk enough of other dangers. Of how to get from Sarkomand to the peopled parts of Dreamland he knew nothing at all, nor could he gain much by descending to the grottos of the ghouls, since he knew they were no better informed than he. The 3 ghouls which helped him through the city of Gugs to the outer world had not known how to reach Sarkomand in their journey back, but had planned to ask old traders in Dilathleen. He did not like to think of going again to the subterranean world of Gugs, and risking once more that hellish tower of Koth, which is cyclopean steps leading into the enchanted wood. Yet he felt he might have to try its course if all else failed. Over Lang's plateau, past the lone monastery, he dared not go unaided, for the high priest's emissaries must be many. While at the journey's end there would be no doubt the Shantoks and perhaps other things to deal with. If he could get a boat, he might sail back to Inganok, past the jagged and hideous rock in the sea, for the primal frescoes in the monastery labyrinth had shewn that this frightful place lies not far from Sarkomand's basalt quays. But to find a boat in this eon-deserted city was no probable thing, and it did not appear likely that he could ever make one. Such were the thoughts of Randolph Carter when a new impression began beating upon his mind. All this while there had stretched before him a great corpse-like corpse-like width of fabled Sarkomond, with its black broken pillars, and crumbling sphinx-crowned gates, and titan stones, and monstrous winged lions, against the sickly glow of the luminous night clouds. Now he saw far ahead, on the right, a glow that no clouds could account for, and knew he was not alone in that silence of that dead city. The glow rose and fell fitfully, flickering with greenish tinge, which did not reassure the watcher. And when he crept closer, down the littered street and through the narrow gaps between tumbled walls, he perceived that it was a campfire near the wharves, with strange, vague forms clustered darkly around it. It was a lethal odor, hanging heavily over all of it. Beyond was the oily lapping of the harbor waters, with a great ship riding at anchor, and Carter passed in stark terror when he knew that the ship was indeed the one of the dreaded black galleys from the moon. Then, just as he was about to creep back from the detestable flame, he saw stirring among the vague dark forms, and heard a peculiar and unmistakable sound. It was the frightened meeping of a ghoul, and in a moment it had swelled into a veritable chorus of anguish. Secure as he was in the shadow of monstrous ruins, Carter allowed his curiosity to conquer his fear. And crept forward, wriggled worm-like on his stomach, and in another place he had to rise to his feet to avoid making a noise among heaps of fallen marble. But always he succeeded in avoiding discovery, so that, in a short time, he had found a spot behind a titan pillar whence he could watch the whole green-lit scene of action. There, around the hideous fire, fed by obnoxious stems of lunar fungi, there squatted a stinking circle of the toad-like moon beasts, whose almost human slaves. Some of the slaves were heating curiously iron spears in the leaping flames, in intervals applying their white-hot points to the 3 tightly trussed prisoners that lay writhing before the leaders of the party. From the motions of their tentacles, Carter could see the blunt-snouted moon beasts were enjoying the spectacle hugely. And vast was his horror when he suddenly recognized the frantic meeping, and knew that the tortured ghouls were none other than the faithful trio which had guided him safely from the abyss, and thereafter set out from the enchanted wood to find Sarkomond in the gate to their native deeps. The number of malodorous moon beasts about that greenish fire was very great, and Carter saw that he could do nothing now to save his former allies. Of how the ghouls had been captured he could not guess, but fancied that the grey toad-like blasphemies had heard them inquire in Dilathaline concerning the way to Sarkomond, and had not wished them to approach so closely the hateful plateau of Lang, and the high priest not to be described. For a moment he pondered on what ought to do, and recalled how near he was to the gate of the ghouls' black kingdom. Clearly it was wisest to creep east to the plaza of Twin Lions, and descend at once to the gulf, where assuredly he would meet no horrors worse than those above, where he might soon find some ghouls eager to rescue their brethren, or perhaps to wipe out the moon beast of the black galley. It occurred to him that the portal, like the other gates of the abyss, might be guarded by the flocks of night gaunts, but he did not fear these faceless creatures now. He had learned that they are bound by solemn treaties with the ghouls, and the ghoul, which was Pickman, had taught him how to glibber a password that they understood. So, Carter began another silent crawl through the ruins, edging slowly toward the great central plaza of the Winged Lions. It was ticklish work, but the moon beasts were pleasantly busy and did not hear the slight noises which he twice made by accident among the scattered stones. At last he reached an open space and picked his way among the stunted trees and briars that had grown up therein. The gigantic lions loomed terrible above him in the sickly glow of the phosphorescent night clouds, but he manfully persisted toward them, and presently crept round to their faces, knowing it was on the side that he must find the mighty darkness in which they guard. 10 feet apart crouched the mocking-faced beasts of diorite, brooding on cyclopean pedestals whose sides were chiseled into fearsome bas-reliefs. Betwixt them was a tilted court with a central space which had once been rallied with balusters of onyx. Midway in this space, a black well opened, and Carter soon saw that he had indeed reached the yawning gulf whose crusted and moldy stone steps led down into the crypts of nightmare. I'm gonna cut it off for tonight. There's been going for about 2 hours almost, two and a half hours. The story is obviously not finished yet, but that's fine. We can continue it next time. Let me bookmark it. So, I think that I will continue the rest of the story on Tuesday, and I believe that at the rate we're going, we will at least finish the story. And let's see. There's a small story after that one. It's only 7 pages long, so we can probably do the end of the story and one small story afterwards. So, yeah, if you want to join me on Tuesday, that would be awesome. And thank you for listening tonight, or whenever you happen to watch this. Yeah, hope you enjoyed, and have a good evening.